The inspection hall was alive with the sharp rhythm of boots against polished concrete, the clinking of buckles, and the low murmur of voices that carried a mix of nervousness and routine. Rows of young recruits stood shoulder to shoulder, their uniforms stiff with starch, faces set in forced composure. The overhead lights hummed, spilling harsh white beams over every crease, every flaw, every speck of dust. Private Elena Carter stood quietly in the third row, her hands clasped tightly behind her back, her chin level, her gaze unwavering. She looked every bit the soldier she had trained to be, uniform immaculate, boots shining with a mirror finish, posture betraying neither fatigue nor doubt. Yet there was something different about her that morning. Unlike the others, who shuffled nervously or whispered jokes under their breath, Elena radiated calm. Not arrogance, not pride, just a stillness that drew glances from those around her. She didn't try to stand out. If anything, she seemed to shrink into herself. But in a room filled with restless energy, her quiet composure made her noticeable. The officers moved methodically down the line, inspecting each soldier with clinical precision. They checked name tags, measured spacing between ribbons, demanded explanations for smudges or uneven creases. Some recruits stammered excuses. Others blushed under criticism. Elena listened without shifting, her breathing steady. Captain Reynolds, a broad-shouldered man with a reputation for sharp eyes and little patience, led the inspection. His gaze was merciless, lingering on every detail. When he stopped in front of Elena, the hall seemed to pause with him. "Private Carter," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "Yes, sir," Elena answered, her voice calm and firm, neither too loud nor too soft. Reynolds studied her for a long moment. He noticed the precision in her uniform, not just correct, but almost obsessively perfect. The brass gleamed like sunlight on water. Her collar sat with surgical alignment. Yet something about her bothered him. It wasn't what he saw, but what he couldn't see. "Step forward," he ordered. Elena obeyed, one step echoing in the silent hall. The other recruits kept their eyes fixed forward, though curiosity rippled like static in the air. Reynolds circled her slowly, hands clasped behind his back. "Immaculate," he muttered. Too immaculate. His voice wasn't loud, but everyone heard it. He stopped directly in front of her. "Remove your jacket." The words landed like a stone dropped in still water. Soldiers shifted uneasily. Removing the jacket during inspection was uncommon, usually reserved for verifying unauthorized markings, scars, or unreported medical conditions. Some recruits smirked, sensing trouble. Elena didn't flinch. Her eyes flicked briefly to the captain's before she gave a curt nod. "Yes, sir." Her hands moved deliberately, unfastening each button with precision. She slipped the jacket from her shoulders, folding it neatly over one arm. Beneath, her plain undershirt clung to the toned lines of someone who had spent months enduring grueling training. But Reynolds wasn't looking at her build. His eyes narrowed at her left arm, as though he had spotted something just beyond sight. "Roll up your sleeve," he commanded. A ripple of whispers spread through the line of recruits. Tattoos were against regulations without clearance, and anyone caught with unauthorized ink usually faced punishment. For the younger soldiers, this was entertainment, a chance to watch someone else squirm under authority. Elena, however, remained calm. She began to roll the sleeve slowly, the fabric sliding upward inch by inch. Her mind flickered briefly to childhood, to the many times she had wondered about the mark on her arm, the questions she could never answer. The recruits leaned forward ever so slightly. Officers watched with tightened expressions. And as the ink began to emerge, the room grew colder, quieter. At first, only a fragment was visible, a dark line curving beneath the pale skin of her forearm. It could have been anything, a scar, a scratch, an accidental blot. But as the sleeve rolled higher, the shape became clearer, more deliberate. The outline of wings. The harsh, simple lines of a symbol forged long before tattoos became fashionable. Reynolds froze. The hall, once alive with nervous energy, now held only silence. Elena stopped, sleeve bunched at her elbow. The tattoo stood fully revealed now. An eagle in mid-screech, its talons clutching crossed daggers. It was faded, the ink worn like an old photograph, yet sharp enough to be unmistakable. She kept her face still, though she could feel the weight of every eye pressing into her skin. "Sir," she said softly, "is something wrong?" Reynolds didn't answer immediately. He took a slow step closer, studying the tattoo as though it had clawed its way out of a nightmare. His lips parted, then closed. He glanced at the other officers. One of them frowned, another's brows shot up in disbelief. The recruits, too, were caught in confusion. Most were too young to understand what they were seeing. To them, it was just ink. Strange, old-fashioned ink, sure, but hardly worth the reaction it was drawing. But to Reynolds, it was impossible. He had spent years studying military history, particularly paratrooper divisions. He knew the Screaming Eagle emblem well. It belonged to the 101st Airborne Division, the legendary Band of Brothers. But this wasn't the standard patch soldiers wore on their uniforms. No, this was something else. This was personal. Reynolds remembered the archived photos, grainy black and whites of soldiers during World War II. Some men had etched their unit pride into their flesh with crude ink and shaky hands, a way to carry their brotherhood even when uniforms were stripped away. He remembered one photo in particular, a young sergeant named Daniel Harper, grinning with his sleeve rolled up, showing this exact design. Harper had gone missing in action on June 6, 1944. His body was never recovered. His tattoo was documented, preserved in records, but no one else had ever worn it. Yet here it was. On a 20-year-old recruit born in 2001, Reynolds swallowed hard. He wanted to demand an explanation, but the words wouldn't come. His mind wrestled between reason and disbelief. It had to be coincidence. It had to be a copy. But the lines, the tiny imperfection in the eagle's left wing, even that detail was identical. He stepped back, his boots echoing sharply against the floor. The room seemed to shrink around Elena. The recruits no longer smirked. Their eyes were wide, their expressions unsettled. Officers whispered to each other in hushed tones, glancing at her as though she had become something more or less than human. Elena stood firm, though confusion trickled at her chest. She had grown up with the mark. Her grandmother always said it was just a birthmark gone strange, though Elena had known better. Tattoos didn't appear at birth. But when she asked questions, the answers never satisfied her. Now, under the glare of fluorescent lights and dozens of stunned eyes, the truth of the tattoos suddenly mattered. And yet, she still had none. Captain Reynolds finally spoke, his voice lower, edged with something that sounded disturbingly like fear. "Private Carter," he said slowly, "where did you get that tattoo?" Elena's eyes met his, calm but questioning. "Sir," she replied, her tone steady, "I've always had it." Her words settled over the room like dust. Silence followed, heavy and suffocating. No one moved. No one spoke. The inspection had ceased to matter. The rules had ceased to matter. Only the ink mattered now. The tattoo that shouldn't exist. The silence in the inspection hall felt like a weight pressing down on everyone's chest. Soldiers who had moments ago stood tall with pride now shifted uneasily, their eyes flicking between Captain Reynolds and the young private whose sleeve revealed something none of them could understand. Elena Carter held her ground. Her pulse was steady, though deep inside she felt the sting of unease. She had been trained to face chaos with composure, but nothing in basic training had prepared her for this. Not the disbelief in her commander's eyes, not the frozen tension that gripped the entire room. Reynolds's jaw worked as though he wanted to speak, but couldn't find the words. At last, he turned sharply, addressing the other officers who flanked him. His voice was low, but carried through the still air. "Take her jacket. We're verifying everything." A sergeant stepped forward and collected the neatly folded uniform from Elena's arm. His hands trembled slightly as he carried it away, as if even the cloth had become tainted by the mystery tattoo. Reynolds turned back to her, his expression unreadable. "Remove your undershirt." Gasps broke out along the rows of recruits. That command went beyond normal inspection. It wasn't unheard of, but it was rare, reserved only for cases where contraband, unauthorized body markings, or evidence of misconduct were suspected. To strip a soldier in front of their peers was both humiliating and unnerving. Elena's lips parted slightly, but she didn't protest. She had nothing to hide, at least nothing she understood. Slowly, she grasped the hem of her shirt, pulling it upward in one fluid motion. The fabric lifted over her head, and she folded it with the same precision she had shown her jacket, setting it aside neatly. Now she stood before them in her regulation sports bra, the room's cold air rushing against her skin. The fluorescent lights illuminated every detail, the strong lines of her shoulders, the taut muscles of her arms, the faint sheen of sweat from standing so long under scrutiny. But no one was looking at her physique. Their eyes were fixed on the ink. It wasn't alone. Reynolds's breath caught as his gaze traveled further. Across her ribs, faint and nearly faded into her skin, was another mark, one that had gone unnoticed under her uniform until now. It was crude, uneven, almost as though scratched by hand rather than tattooed by needle. The letters were jagged but legible. H.R.P.R. A name. Reynolds's throat tightened. He staggered back a step before catching himself. God Almighty. The hall erupted into murmurs. Some recruits craned their necks, trying to get a clearer look. Others looked away, disturbed by the strangeness of it all. Officers exchanged bewildered glances, their professionalism cracked wide open by shock. Elena stared at the name, her own eyes widening as though she were truly seeing it for the first time. She had always known about the eagle on her arm, but this scrawled name she had never noticed, not in the mirror, not during training, not once in her life. "Sir," she said carefully, her voice steady but uncertain. "I don't understand." It wasn't there before. Reynolds rounded on her, his composure cracking into frustration. "Don't play games with me, Private." That name belongs to Sergeant Daniel Harper, a paratrooper from the 101st Airborne Division. He disappeared during the Normandy invasion in 1944. His voice echoed like thunder in the sterile hall. Elena blinked, her lips parting in disbelief. "I don't know any Harper, sir." The captain's eyes burned with suspicion, but beneath that suspicion was something else, fear. He wanted to accuse her of forgery, of trickery, of somehow orchestrating this elaborate farce. But how? She was too young to know these details, too ordinary a recruit to pull off something so chilling. He barked to the sergeant at his side. "Document this. Get photographs. Every angle." The sergeant nodded, fumbling for a camera from his kit. He approached Elena hesitantly, as though she might vanish or explode if he got too close. The shutter clicked rapidly, capturing the eagle, the daggers, the faded letters scrawled into her ribs. Each flash of the camera seemed to burn the images deeper into everyone's minds. This wasn't some story passed around in a bar, or a rumor whispered in barracks. This was real, tangible, undeniable. Elena stood rigid, her breathing measured, though her heart raced beneath her calm exterior. She felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with clothing. The stares of her fellow soldiers pierced her, some wide-eyed with awe, others narrowing with suspicion. She was no longer just Private Carter to them. She was something else, something unsettling. Reynolds gestured sharply toward the door. "Carter, with me, now." The command snapped like a whip. Elena gathered her undershirt and jacket quickly, clutching them to her chest. As she followed the captain, the recruits parted like water, their eyes never leaving her. She felt every step weighted with the crushing awareness that nothing about her life would be the same after this moment. The hallway outside the inspection hall was quiet, the sound of their boots echoing off the concrete walls. Reynolds didn't speak as he led her toward a private office. His shoulders were rigid, his fists clenched at his sides. Elena kept pace behind him, her mind racing with questions she couldn't form into words. When they reached the office, Reynolds shut the door with a sharp click and turned on her. His face was pale, his voice raw with disbelief. "Do you have any idea what you're carrying on your skin?" Elena met his gaze. "No, sir. I've had the eagle tattoo for as long as I can remember. The name? I swear I never saw it until now." Reynolds leaned against the desk, rubbing his temples. "This doesn't make sense." "It can't make sense. Harper's tattoo was recorded in 1943. Only his unit knew of it. And the name? The name wasn't a tattoo at all. It was carved into his body by one of his brothers in arms, a promise that he'd never be forgotten if the war swallowed him whole." Elena's breath caught. Her grandmother's voice flickered in her memory, the story she had told of a lost brother, the one who never returned from the war. She had dismissed them as family folklore, the kind of story meant to keep grief alive. But now those words clawed at her, demanding to be remembered. "Sir," she whispered, almost against her will, "my grandmother. She used to tell stories about a brother who went missing in France. She said his name was Danny." Reynolds froze. The silence stretched, heavy with implications neither of them wanted to accept. The tattoo, the name, the family story. Coincidence couldn't explain it. Reynolds stared at her, his voice barely above a whisper. "Private, what the hell are you?" Elena had no answer, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure she wanted one. The office door clicked shut behind them, shutting out the low hum of activity from the hallway. Inside, the air felt heavier, thick with unspoken questions. Captain Reynolds stood stiffly at his desk, his jaw tight, his hands pressed flat against the wood, as though bracing himself against a storm. Private Elena Carter stood at attention, her uniform folded neatly in her arms, her sleeves still rolled high. The ink, that strange faded emblem, seemed to pulse in the fluorescent light, commanding attention no matter how much she wished it wouldn't. Reynolds stared at it again. The eagle with outstretched wings, the talons clutching crossed daggers. He didn't just recognize the design. He remembered it. He remembered staring at it in black and white photographs tucked into old archives. He remembered seeing it on the arm of Sergeant Daniel Harper in a faded military record, one of hundreds of images he'd studied as a young officer with a fascination for paratrooper history. But this wasn't a photograph. This wasn't a dusty record stored in a drawer. This was flesh. This was now. "Sit," Reynolds ordered finally, gesturing toward the chair in front of his desk. Elena obeyed, lowering herself carefully. Her uniform rested in her lap, her hands folded over it like a shield. She felt the weight of his gaze bore into her, but she kept her eyes forward, her posture military perfect. Reynolds broke the silence with a question that sounded less like a demand and more like a plea. "Where did you get that tattoo?" Elena met his stare, her voice calm but edged with frustration. "Sir, I've told you. I didn't get it anywhere. It's always been there. Since I was a kid." Reynolds' eyes narrowed. "That's not possible. You can't be born with a tattoo." "I know, sir," Elena admitted. Her tone softened, as if she were speaking to herself. But I can't explain it either. I've had it as long as I can remember. My grandmother used to call it my soldier's mark. I thought it was just something she said to make it sound special. The captain's chest tightened at her words. Soldier's mark. The phrase sent a chill crawling up his spine. He pulled open a drawer, retrieving a thick folder bound with a rubber band. Flipping it open, he pulled out a black and white photo and placed it on the desk between them. The grainy image showed a group of soldiers in paratrooper uniforms, grinning at the camera, helmets slung casually in their hands. One man had his sleeve rolled high, proudly displaying the crude tattoo inked into his arm. "Look," Reynolds said, his voice sharper now. Elena leaned forward. The photograph was old, the edges curled, but the details were clear enough. Her eyes locked on the tattoo, the eagle, the daggers, the same imperfect lines. Her lips parted slightly. She looked at her own arm, then back at the photo. The match was undeniable. "That's impossible," she whispered. Reynolds's finger jabbed at the man in the picture. "That's Sergeant Daniel Harper. Normandy, 1944. He went missing during the invasion. His body was never found." Elena swallowed hard. My grandmother's stories. Her brother's name was Danny. The captain's face paled. The silence that followed was thick with implications neither dared voice. The parallels were too precise, too uncanny. A tattoo that shouldn't exist. A family story of a missing soldier named Danny. Reynolds pulled in a deep breath, steadying himself. "This isn't a coincidence, Carter. Tattoos aren't genetic. They don't just appear across generations. And no one outside Harper's unit even knew about this design. It wasn't regulation. It wasn't documented officially." Elena shook her head, confusion clouding her eyes. "Then how do I have it?" Reynolds slammed the folder shut, his frustration breaking through. "That's what I intend to find out." At that moment, the office door creaked open. Sergeant Halley, the one who had taken photographs earlier, stepped inside, his face pale. He held a stack of freshly printed images, the tattoo captured in stark detail from every angle. He laid them on the desk without a word. Reynolds spread the photographs out, comparing them to the archival photo. His hands trembled slightly as he moved between them. "Identical," he muttered. "Every line, every imperfection, even the flaw in the wing." Elena stared at the photos, her heart thudding louder with every passing second. The images didn't lie. She had known the tattoo was unusual, but never had she imagined it tied to a stranger from history. "Sir," she said quietly, "maybe someone in my family." "No," Reynolds cut her off sharply. "You don't understand. This design wasn't public. It wasn't in books, not in museums, not anywhere. The only record of it was in restricted archives, preserved by the Army. I've studied them. I know this." Elena's throat tightened. The room felt suddenly smaller, the walls pressing in. She had walked into an ordinary inspection, and now found herself entangled in something that defied explanation. Reynolds rubbed his temples, pacing the office. His voice grew low, more to himself than to her. "This isn't possible. Unless—" He stopped, glancing at her again, his eyes narrowing with something between suspicion and awe. "Unless it's not just ink." Elena frowned. "What do you mean?" The captain didn't answer. Instead, he snatched up the phone on his desk, his voice brisk and commanding as he barked orders. "Get me Lieutenant Monroe, now, and pull the full file on Sergeant Daniel Harper. I want everything. Service records, medical notes, personal effects, everything." Elena sat silently, gripping the fabric of her uniform tighter. She had been trained to follow orders, to face drills, to endure exhaustion. But nothing had prepared her for this, for being treated like an artifact instead of a soldier. for her very skin to become a battlefield of questions. When Reynolds finally set the phone down, he looked at her again, his eyes hard. "Until we get answers, Carter, you don't breathe a word of this to anyone. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," she replied, though her voice carried hesitation. He leaned closer, his tone cold and precise. "What you carry on your skin isn't just a tattoo. It's a ghost. And ghosts don't belong in my ranks." Elena held his stare, her heart hammering. For the first time, she felt the weight of the mark not as a curiosity, but as a burden. A shadow that stretched far beyond her life, reaching back into a war she had never fought. And in that moment, she realized something chilling. Whatever the truth was, she wasn't just Elena Carter anymore. She was the girl with the tattoo that shouldn't exist. The office was silent, except for the hum of the fluorescent light above. Captain Reynolds's words, "It's a ghost," lingered like smoke in the air, refusing to fade. Private Elena Carter sat stiffly in her chair, every muscle in her body taut. Her sleeve was still rolled up, the eagle and daggers glaring from her skin as though mocking the very order of things. The photographs spread across the desk only deepened the unease. The black and white ink frozen in time on Sergeant Harper's arm, mirroring the ink that now lived on hers. The door opened without a knock. Lieutenant Monroe entered, carrying a slim file tucked under his arm. His face showed curiosity rather than concern, as if he had been summoned for a trivial verification. But the moment his eyes fell on Elena's arm, his expression shifted. He froze mid-step. "What the—" His voice trailed off as he stepped closer, almost against his will. That's Harper's tattoo." Reynolds's voice was clipped. "You're certain?" Monroe set the file on the desk, his eyes still locked on the mark. "I don't need the file to tell me. I've seen the photograph dozens of times. The eagle, the daggers, even that crooked line in the left wing. No one else had it. Harper's mark was unique. It's him." Elena's stomach twisted. She didn't want to be him. She wanted to be herself. Elena Carter, Private, United States Army. Not a living canvas of some soldier lost 80 years ago. Reynolds snatched the file from the desk and flipped it open. Inside were copies of Harper's service records, his enlistment papers, and most disturbingly, a grainy medical report documenting his identifying features. Included was a crude sketch of his tattoo. He shoved the paper toward Elena. "Look at it." She hesitated, then leaned forward. The drawing was rough but clear enough. The screaming eagle, its talons clutching crossed blades. Identical. The imperfection in the wing was there too, drawn with almost apologetic lines. Her throat felt dry. "Sir, I can't explain this." Reynolds slammed the file shut, the sound startling in the quiet room. He turned sharply to Monroe. "Tell me it's a forgery. Tell me there's some rational explanation." Monroe shook his head, his brow furrowed in disbelief. "There isn't. Harper's tattoo was never published, never publicized. The only people who saw it were his unit brothers. And most of them didn't live to tell the story. For her to have it." He trailed off, unable to finish. Reynolds pinched the bridge of his nose, his composure fraying. "This makes no sense. None." Elena's voice cut through the tension, softer but steady. "Sir, with respect, if I'm not supposed to have it, then why do I? There has to be some explanation." Her words hung in the air. Reynolds wanted to snap back, to dismiss her, but the quiet determination in her tone stopped him. She wasn't mocking him, wasn't trying to trick him. She was genuinely searching for answers. Monroe cleared his throat. "Sir, Harper's file contains something else." He opened the folder again and pulled out a single yellowed page. It was a letter, or rather a copy of one, written by Harper before he shipped out for Normandy. The handwriting was uneven, hurried, but the words were legible. If I don't make it back, I want my brothers to know I was proud to fight alongside them. Tell my sister I'll always be with her, one way or another. Even if I can't come home, a part of me will find a way. Elena's breath caught. Her grandmother's words echoed in her memory. Danny never came home. But I swear sometimes I feel like he's still here, watching. Her heart pounded. Could it be? Could this mark, etched into her skin since childhood, be that part he had spoken of? Reynolds read the letter silently, his lips pressed thin. He set it down carefully, as though afraid it might crumble to dust. Then he looked at Elena, his eyes sharp. You said your grandmother told you stories. Yes, sir. Her brother. His name was Danny? Yes. Reynolds exhaled slowly, the pieces clicking into place against his will. Your grandmother's brother. And Harper's sister. That would make you his great-niece. Elena's eyes widened. The thought had never crossed her mind. She had known vaguely of a relative lost in the war, but the connection had always been distant, abstract. Now it felt disturbingly real. Reynolds paced the room, his boots striking the floor like a drumbeat. This isn't just coincidence. The tattoo, the name, the family tie. It's too much. Monroe's voice dropped to a whisper. It's as if he left a mark behind. Something that carried through blood, through generations. Reynolds rounded on him. Are you suggesting reincarnation? Ghost stories? Because that's what this sounds like. Monroe held up his hands. I'm not suggesting anything, sir. I'm just saying. Sometimes history refuses to stay buried. Elena sat quietly, absorbing their words. Her pulse thrummed in her ears. She wanted to reject it all, the idea that she was tied to Harper in some supernatural way, that her skin bore a soldier's unfinished story. But the evidence was undeniable. The tattoo existed. The name existed. The family tie existed. Reynolds stopped pacing and fixed her with a hard stare. Private Carter, until we know more, you are not to speak of this. Not to your peers, not to anyone outside this office. Do you understand? Yes, sir, Elena said, though the weight of the command settled heavily on her shoulders. Reynolds leaned across the desk, his eyes burning. You are a soldier in my ranks. But you are also a question I don't know how to answer. And that terrifies me. For the first time, Elena saw not just authority in his gaze, but fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of history bleeding into the present. Fear of her. The office was silent again, the kind of silence that felt alive, charged with electricity. The three of them stood on the edge of something bigger than themselves, a mystery that defied reason, a story resurrected in flesh and ink. Elena lowered her eyes to the tattoo on her arm. The eagle glared back, its wings spread wide, its daggers crossed like a challenge. A mark that belonged to a man who had vanished 8 decades ago. A mark that now belonged to her. And for the first time in her life, Elena Carter wondered if she was carrying more than her own destiny. The rune's tension felt heavier than steel. Elena sat with her sleeve rolled high, the tattoo on display like evidence in a trial she hadn't agreed to. Across the desk, Captain Reynolds's jaw was tight, his gaze flicking between her arm and the files, as though staring longer might force the universe to give up its secrets. Lieutenant Monroe hovered at the side, shifting uneasily, caught between fascination and unease. You expect me to believe, Reynolds said finally, his voice low and deliberate, that you've had this tattoo since childhood. Elena straightened. Yes, sir. No ink runs this deep without a needle, Reynolds pressed. No artist carves a mark like that by accident. And yet you claim it's always been there? Yes, sir, she repeated, though this time her voice wavered. She hated how it sounded like a lie, even when it was the truth. Monroe leaned forward, his tone softer. Tell us, Carter. Did anyone in your family ever talk about this mark? Did your parents, your grandmother, anyone mention it? Her lips parted, then closed again. The answer rose unbidden from memory, carried on the fragile voice of an old woman in a rocking chair. He had a wild streak, that Danny, Grandma Ruth used to say. Said he wanted to jump out of airplanes with eagles on his back. He was fearless, that boy. Too fearless, maybe. Elena blinked. The recollection felt sharper now, tinged with new meaning. My grandmother, she admitted slowly. She told me stories about her brother, Danny Harper. She said he disappeared in France. His body was never recovered. Reynolds stilled. Monroe exchanged a quick look with him. So your grandmother is Harper's sister, Monroe murmured. That makes you. Bloodline. Elena's heart pounded. Bloodline. It sounded almost ritualistic, as if carrying his name somehow explained the ink that had haunted her skin all her life. Reynolds snapped open the file again and shoved it toward her. Harper was 22 when he vanished over Normandy. His entire unit saw him fall. His dog tags were never recovered. He was declared Mia, presumed dead. You think your grandmother's bedtime stories explain why his tattoo is on your arm? The words cut deep, but Elena didn't flinch. I don't know what explains it, sir. But I know it's not a trick. It's not a lie. It's just there. It's always been there. Monroe studied her, his brow furrowed. Maybe the story goes deeper than you realize. Families keep secrets. Maybe she knew more than she ever told you. Elena's throat tightened. The memory of Ruth's voice returned, clearer now. Sometimes, I swear I see him when I close my eyes. Not as he was, but as if he's still walking, still out there. Danny told me once, don't worry, sis. Even if I don't come back, I'll find a way home. At the time, Elena had smiled politely at her grandmother's sentiment. Now, sitting under the interrogation of two officers, she wasn't so sure. Reynolds slammed the file shut. This is not a fairy tale. This is the United States Army. Soldiers don't rise from the dead, and tattoos don't crawl down family trees. Elena swallowed. Then why do I have it? The room fell silent. The question had no answer, and the weight of it pressed down on all of them. Hours later, Elena was escorted back to her quarters. The silence in the barracks felt suffocating compared to the scrutiny of the office. She lay on her bunk, staring at the ceiling, her arms still bared, the ink stark against her skin. She remembered being a child, sitting on her grandmother's lap, tracing the lines of the mark while Ruth hummed softly. You've always had that, Ellie, Ruth had whispered once. A piece of the past written on you. Maybe it's a reminder that we don't choose all our battles. Some are chosen for us. Elena had thought nothing of it then, chalking it up to an old woman's poetic wisdom. But now the words haunted her. A knock at the door pulled her back to the present. Monroe stepped inside, closing it quietly behind him. Private, he said, his voice low. Off the record. Do you really not know where it came from? Elena shook her head. No, sir. I swear. Monroe studied her for a long moment, then sighed. Your grandmother may have known. Sometimes people hide the strangest truths. You should talk to her if she's still alive. Alana's chest tightened. She passed 2 years ago. I'm sorry, Monroe said gently. But maybe she left something behind. Letters, journals. Families like yours, with history like this, they don't just let go. Elena felt a strange determination harden in her chest. If her grandmother had left breadcrumbs, she would find them. The next evening, she received permission to call home. Her mother answered, her voice weary but warm. Ellie, everything all right? Elena hesitated, then asked, Mom, did Grandma Ruth ever tell you about Uncle Danny's tattoo? Silence on the line. A pause too long, too deliberate. "Why do you ask?" her mother replied finally. "Because I have it," Elena said, her voice trembling despite her resolve. "On my arm. The same one. And the army knows." Her mother's breath caught audibly. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "She told me once that the family was marked, that Danny said he'd carry us with him, no matter what. I thought it was just her way of holding on. I never imagined." Elena gripped the receiver tightly. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" "Because I didn't want you to carry the weight," her mother admitted. "Your grandmother believed he would live on somehow, that someone would bear his memory in flesh. When you were born with that mark, she said, 'There, he's home.'" Alana's vision blurred. Her grandmother's voice, her mother's confession, it all tangled together, forming a story she had been living without knowing it. Home. He was home. When she returned to duty, Elena carried herself differently. The tattoo no longer felt like an accident or a curse. It felt like inheritance, a story etched into her skin long before she understood its meaning. But not everyone saw it as heritage. Some whispered behind her back, soldiers unsettled by what they'd overheard. "Haunted ink," one called it. "Ghost mark," another sneered. Elena ignored them. She had survived harder things. What mattered now was not the whispers, but the truth waiting beneath them. Reynolds summoned her again days later. His eyes were colder now, less curious and more calculating. "You've stirred something dangerous, Carter," he warned. "The Army doesn't like mysteries. We like facts, and you are not a fact I can file away neatly." Elena held his gaze. "With respect, sir, maybe I'm not meant to be filed away." Reynolds's jaw clenched, but for once he didn't argue. That night, as the barracks quieted and sleep settled over the base, Elena sat awake with a notebook in her lap. She began to write fragments of her grandmother's stories, her mother's confession, the photographs from Harper's file. Piece by piece, she stitched together the story she hadn't known she was carrying. It wasn't just Harper's story anymore. It was hers. And though she didn't yet understand why, she knew one thing with certainty. The tattoo wasn't an accident. It was a calling. The morning came heavy with gray clouds, pressing low against the horizon. The base always looked colder under such skies, rows of barracks and hangars reduced to a palette of iron and ash. Private Elena Carter sat on the edge of her bunk, her sleeve rolled high, staring at the mark that had turned her life upside down. The ink hadn't changed, yet everything around it had. By mid-morning, 2 MPs appeared at her door. "Captain Reynolds wants you," one said curtly. Elena stood without protest, though her pulse quickened. They escorted her across the gravel lot to the administration building, their boots crunching in rhythm, their silence as sharp as a blade. When she entered Reynolds's office, the air was already different, tighter, expectant. Another man stood at the far end of the room, older, with silver at his temples, glasses perched low on his nose. He wore a plain suit instead of a uniform, but his posture carried the weight of someone long accustomed to discipline. On the desk beside him rested a worn leather satchel. Reynolds gestured stiffly. "Private Carter. This is Dr. Alan Whitaker, senior historian with the Army's Center of Military History." Whitaker offered a polite nod, his eyes narrowing with academic curiosity. "Private." His voice was smooth, precise, the kind that measured words as carefully as artifacts. Elena saluted Reynolds, then stood at ease, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Reynolds wasted no time. "Doctor, show her." Whitaker opened the satchel and carefully withdrew a folder thick with aged documents. He laid out several photographs across the desk. Black and white images, blurred at the edges, their subjects young men in paratrooper uniforms. In two of them, a smiling soldier posed with his sleeve rolled high, revealing the unmistakable eagle and crossed daggers. Elena's breath caught. The resemblance was uncanny. The tattoo was cruder, the lines less refined, but the design was identical. Whitaker adjusted his glasses, leaning closer to her arm. "May I?" Elena hesitated, then extended her forearm. His hands didn't touch, but hovered just above, tracing the air as his eyes studied the ink with meticulous care. "Yes," he murmured. The talons curved the same way. The wing has the same fracture in its line. Even the spacing between the blades matches perfectly. He reached for one of the photos and held it beside her arm. The past and present blurred in that moment. Two skins, decades apart, bearing the same scar of ink. "This isn't imitation," Whitaker said finally, his tone tinged with awe. "This is replication. Exact. Down to errors the original artist himself noted in his journal." Reynolds's expression hardened, though his eyes betrayed unease. "So you're confirming it?" Whitaker nodded. "Without question. This tattoo belonged exclusively to Sergeant Daniel Harper, 82nd Airborne Division, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. No records exist of anyone else bearing this design. Photographs, field notes, eyewitness accounts, all point to him. And yet," he looked at Elena, his gaze sharp as a scalpel. "Here it is, alive on her arm." The room felt smaller suddenly, the air heavier. Elena swallowed hard. "Doctor, what are you saying? That I'm carrying his tattoo by chance? Or," Whitaker tilted his head, "chance? No, this is not coincidence. Coincidence would be similarity. This is exactness. It's as though history has bled into you." Reynolds barked. "Don't feed her nonsense, Whitaker. This isn't a seance. It's the Army. We deal in facts." Whitaker didn't flinch. "Facts are precisely why I'm unsettled, Captain. The facts here do not align with possibility. Tattoos don't transfer through bloodlines. They don't appear without ink. And yet, here it is. If this isn't history repeating itself, then what is it?" Elena looked between them, her pulse racing. She wanted answers, but every answer only opened another door. Whitaker slid another document across the desk, a yellowed page filled with handwriting. "This is from Harper's personal effects. A note written in June 1944, days before the Normandy drop. He described the tattoo, said it was a promise. 'If I fall,' he wrote, 'this eagle will carry me home.'" Elena's throat tightened. She could almost hear her grandmother's voice, echoing the same sentiment. "He said he'd always find his way home." Her hand trembled as she lowered it over the mark, covering it as if shielding herself from the weight of generations. Reynolds leaned back in his chair, his voice hard. "So what do you suggest, Doctor? That Carter here is Harper reborn? That his ghost climbed into her skin?" Whitaker chose his words carefully. "I don't suggest. I observe. And what I observe defies explanation. The Army can dismiss it, bury it, call it anomaly. But make no mistake, this is history in the flesh." Silence pressed down on the room. The tick of the wall clock grew louder, each second a reminder that time was still moving, even when logic stood still. Finally, Reynolds pushed back from the desk. "Private Carter, you are to continue your duties. But understand this, your mark is not to be discussed outside this office. You will follow orders, you will train, and you will keep this matter buried. Is that clear?" Elena forced herself to meet his gaze. "Yes, sir." Whitaker gathered the photographs slowly, his hands almost reverent. Before slipping them into the folder, he glanced at her one last time. "Private, you may not want this, but you are the keeper of something larger than yourself. Don't ignore it." Helena nodded faintly, though her chest tightened. Keeper. The word felt like both a burden and a crown. Later that night, Elena sat alone in the barracks, the hum of silence louder than the chatter of her squadmates asleep around her. She pulled out a small notebook and began copying the words from Harper's letter she had seen. If I fall, this eagle will carry me home. Her hand shook as she wrote. She thought about Whitaker's words, history in the flesh. She thought about Reynolds's warning, marry it. She thought about her grandmother's whispers, he'll always find his way home. For the first time, Elena wondered if she wasn't just carrying his mark, but his unfinished journey. What if her enlistment, her choice to wear the uniform, hadn't been a choice at all? What if it was destiny? The following week, she noticed how the soldiers around her looked at her differently. No one spoke openly, but whispers carried farther than words. Some stared at her with awe, others with unease. To them, she wasn't just another private anymore. She was something they couldn't name. During a drill, one soldier muttered, "That's the ghost girl." Another replied, more like cursed ink. Elena ignored them outwardly, but the words pierced deep. That night, as she traced the lines of the tattoo under the dim barracks light, she whispered to herself, "Who are you, Harper? And why me?" The ink gave no answer, but its presence was louder than silence. In a corner of the base museum, Whitaker pored over records late into the night. He compared photographs, journals, and Elena's file with obsessive precision. And the deeper he went, the less sense it made. One entry in Harper's journal haunted him. If the eagle carries me, then maybe my fight isn't over. Maybe it just changes hands. Whitaker rubbed his eyes, the weight of the discovery pressing against him. He whispered to the empty room, "Maybe it already has." Back in her bunk, Elena dreamed. She dreamed of parachutes unfolding against a moonlit sky, of tracer fire ripping through clouds, of boots slamming into French soil. She dreamed of a man's voice calling, "Go, go, go," and felt the rush of air burn her face. When she woke, breathless, her arm ached where the tattoo lay. And for the first time, she didn't just feel like Elena Carter. She felt like someone else was with her. Whispers travel faster than orders in a military base. By the end of the week, every corridor seemed to echo with some version of Elena Carter's story. In the chow hall, heads turned when she entered. Conversations dropped to hushed tones. Some soldiers stared openly, curiosity written across their faces. Others looked away quickly, as though afraid to meet her eyes. She carried her tray down the aisle, forcing herself not to react. The seat she chose remained conspicuously empty around her, an invisible barrier of unease. She heard the words slip from one table to another. Ghost mark. Harper's girl. Reincarnation. She clenched her jaw. She had survived boot camp, grueling drills, and the unforgiving bark of drill sergeants. But the weight of whispers was heavier than any pack she'd carried. That night in the barracks, Private Johnson broke the silence. "You gonna tell us what it means, Carter?" he asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. Elena looked up from lacing her boots. "What?" "The tattoo." We all heard. "It's Harper's, right? The dead paratrooper. So what's the deal? You some kind of medium?" The room chuckled nervously, but no one defended her. Elena tightened her laces and stood, her gaze steady. "I'm a soldier," she said flatly. "Same as you." "That's all you need to know," Johnson snorted. "Yeah, sure." A soldier with a ghost strapped to her arm. The words hit harder than she let show. She walked out before her anger betrayed her. Outside, the night air was sharp, filled with the faint hum of distant machinery. She sat on the steps, her hands trembling. The tattoo seemed to burn under her sleeve, as if the ink itself had heard the insult. She whispered into the darkness, "Am I carrying you, Harper?" Or are you carrying me? Captain Reynolds summoned her again 2 days later. His office smelled of stale coffee and tension. You've become a distraction, he said bluntly. Half the base is talking about you. Elena stood at attention. Sir, I haven't spoken of it. You don't have to, Reynolds snapped. The silence feeds the fire. Men see you differently now. Some are fascinated. Some are afraid. Neither is good for discipline. Her chest tightened. What do you want me to do, sir? Scrub it off? The corner of his mouth twitched. For once, his hard exterior faltered. If only it were that simple. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Listen to me, Carter. You've got potential. But if you let this nonsense consume you, it'll eat your career alive. You can't fight a ghost. Focus on the army, not the ink. Yes, sir, she replied, though inside, his words rang hollow. She wasn't sure anymore where the army ended and the ink began. Whitaker, the historian, sought her out later in the base museum. The building was quiet, filled with relics of wars long past, faded flags, dented helmets, letters behind glass. He gestured her toward a display case holding photographs of the 82nd Airborne. You see them? He asked softly. Young men, most of them barely older than you. Harper among them. They leapt into the unknown, into fire and chaos, knowing half wouldn't return. Elena stared at the faces, frozen in youth. One photograph pulled her in. Harper himself, grinning, his sleeve rolled up to show the eagle. Whitaker's voice was low. Do you feel it? The connection? Elena hesitated. Sometimes I dream things. Parachutes, gunfire. I wake up with my heart racing, like I've been there. Whitaker's eyes sharpened. That's not imagination. That's memory bleeding through. Whether you want it or not, you're tied to him. Perhaps you're carrying what he couldn't finish. She hugged her arms tightly. And if I don't want it? History doesn't ask permission, he said simply. The dreams grew stronger in the nights that followed. She saw flashes, boots sinking into mud, hands clutching rifles, the distant roar of artillery. She felt the wind tear at her face, as though she were falling from the sky. Sometimes in the mirror, she thought the tattoo looked darker, sharper, alive. When she confided this to no one, it was because she feared the answer. Drills continued, but Elena threw herself into them with new ferocity. Each mile she ran, each push-up she forced, each shot she fired, felt like more than training. It felt like honoring something larger. Her body ached, but she pushed harder. If she carried Harper's mark, she would not carry it weakly. Other soldiers began to notice. Even Johnson, who had mocked her, muttered under his breath after one training run, Damn, she doesn't quit. Respect didn't silence the whispers, but it began to shift them. No longer just Ghost Girl, some started calling her Iron Carter. The names didn't matter. What mattered was that when she looked at the tattoo now, she no longer felt only confusion. She felt purpose. One evening, she found herself back at the museum, staring at Harper's photo again. The grin, the rolled sleeve, the promise in his eyes. She whispered, I don't know why you're on my arm, but if I'm supposed to carry you, I will. Not as a curse, as a duty. For a moment, the silence felt like an answer, not in words, but in a strange steadiness settling over her. Back in his office, Captain Reynolds read reports from across the base. The whispers about Carter weren't fading. He rubbed his temples, torn between irritation and something else he wouldn't name aloud, unease. He thought of her standing in front of him, the ink undeniable on her arm. He thought of Harper's photo in the archives, the same mark glaring back. Reynolds had spent his career believing in order, rules, logic. But Carter? Carter was disorder wrapped in discipline, a question with no answer. And questions, he knew, had a way of changing everything. As the days passed, Elena began to accept the two lives stitched into her skin. One was hers, Private Carter, daughter, granddaughter, soldier. The other was Harper's, paratrooper, fighter, lost but not gone. She didn't have to choose between them. She carried both. And in carrying both, she began to feel stronger than she ever had. But strength had its price. Because while Elena was learning to embrace the tattoo as legacy, others in power were starting to see it differently. Not as history, not as destiny, but as a threat. And threats the army did not ignore. The early morning fog draped the base like a veil, hiding rows of barracks and parade grounds beneath a gray shroud. Private Elena Carter stood at attention, her uniform crisp, her eyes fixed forward. The tattoo on her arm was no longer just ink. It was a story, a history etched in flesh, a legacy she had been carrying without understanding, until now. Captain Reynolds paced in front of the assembled soldiers. His usual stern demeanor was tempered with something he refused to name. Awe, perhaps, or unease. "Today," he began, his voice cutting through the morning chill, "we have a soldier among us unlike any other. Not because of rank, not because of awards, but because of what she carries, a piece of history. A piece of a man who fought for this country, who gave everything, and who never returned." Elena's heart thumped in her chest, but she did not break formation. She had learned to endure scrutiny. But now, it wasn't just endurance. It was purpose. Reynolds's gaze flicked to her arm. The eagle, the crossed daggers, the jagged line in the wing, all perfectly visible under the rolled sleeve. "Private Carter," he said, his voice softer now, "your tattoo, your mark, is Sergeant Daniel Harper's. We've verified it with the Army historian. It's unique. And for reasons we cannot explain, it resides on you. You are carrying his legacy." Murmurs ran through the ranks. Soldiers exchanged glances, some skeptical, others wide-eyed with curiosity. Elena felt the weight of their attention, but she no longer felt fear. "Yes, sir," she replied firmly. "I understand," Reynolds nodded. "Then carry it well." Later in the base museum, Elena met Dr. Alan Whitaker again. He had spent hours compiling records, photographs, and letters. He handed her a folder thick with Harper's history. "Read it," he said gently. "Not as a ghost story, not as something to fear, but as truth." Elena opened the folder, flipping through faded photographs of Harper with his fellow soldiers, letters to his family, and journals describing every jump, every mission, every fear, and every triumph. She read his words aloud quietly. "If I fall, may someone carry the fight. May someone honor the promise. Even if I am gone, let my mark live." Tears welled in her eyes. Harper's voice, once distant, now spoke directly to her. She realized that she had been chosen, not by chance, not by accident, but by something larger than herself. "You understand now," Whitaker said softly. "He didn't survive the war, but his story isn't over. You are the continuation." Elena nodded. "I understand." In the weeks that followed, she threw herself into training, into duties, into every task with renewed vigor. She became not just a soldier, but a symbol. Others looked to her not for fear or curiosity, but for inspiration. Even Private Johnson, who had mocked her earlier, offered a reluctant nod during drills. "You fight like you've been through hell," he muttered. Elena smiled faintly. "Maybe I have," she said quietly. Reynolds observed from afar, his expression unreadable. He had once been unsettled by the tattoo, by the whispers, by the impossibility of it all. Now he saw something different, resolve. Elena carried the weight of history, and yet she did not falter. She did not complain. She did not break. And that was leadership in its rawest form. One night, alone in her quarters, Helena traced the eagle's wings with her finger. She whispered softly, "I will honor you, Harper. I will carry your story, not as a ghost, but as your voice." She thought back to her grandmother's words, Ruth's old voice in the rocking chair. "Even if he doesn't come home, a part of him will find a way." Now she understood. He had found a way through her. The dreams continued, but they were no longer terrifying. She saw Harper's missions, felt his fear, his courage, and through it all, she felt a shared strength. The past and present intertwined in her, guiding her. She was no longer a passive witness. She was the bearer, the keeper, the living continuation of a story that had started long before she was born. The base began to notice the change. Soldiers who had whispered behind her back now looked at her with quiet respect. Instructors commented on her composure, her skill, and her uncanny intuition during drills. Reynolds called her into his office one afternoon. "Carter," he said, "you've done well. Better than I expected. The tattoo? The story? It doesn't frighten you anymore. It seems to strengthen you." "Yes, sir," Elena replied. "It reminds me of what I fight for. Not just myself, but everyone who came before me." Reynolds leaned back in his chair, staring at the mark on her arm. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider the impossible. That this tattoo, this ghost of a soldier long gone, had found a way to persist through blood, through generations, through time itself. "Carry it well, Carter," he said finally. "History is a heavy thing to bear, but you make it lighter." Months later, the base held a ceremony. Harper's name, long missing from formal records, was added to the wall of honor. Elena stood in front of it, the tattoo visible under her rolled sleeve, the eagle and daggers gleaming in the morning sun. The ceremony was solemn. Fellow soldiers, officers, and historians gathered to acknowledge not just the past, but the continuation of its story. Whitaker stood nearby, his expression proud and reverent. Reynolds gave a brief speech, his voice steady. "Today, we honor Sergeant Daniel Harper. And in Private Elena Carter, we honor the living embodiment of his courage, his promise, and his legacy." Elena felt tears prick her eyes. She looked at the wall, at the names etched there, and whispered softly, "I will not let you be forgotten." Later that evening, she returned to her quarters, exhausted but resolute. She traced the tattoo one final time for the day and spoke aloud, "I am Elena Carter. I am Sergeant Harper's mark. I am history and the present, and I will carry both forward." She lay back, finally at peace. The dreams would continue, perhaps forever, but they no longer frightened her. They were guidance, memory, and courage entwined in the lines of ink. For the first time, she didn't see the tattoo as an accident. She saw it as a calling. And in that moment, she understood what her grandmother had meant all those years ago. Some battles are chosen for you, and some heroes never truly die. They live on. In her. In the mark that should never have existed.